for one, I mean, we don't have diplomatic relations with Israel, so there's nothing to break.
Okay, right.
Second of all, which means that we also don't have, sort of like formal trade relations and so on directly with Israel. We don't have that, so there's nothing to break as well. In terms of sanction, I don't think the government can officially, put sanction and everything. I don't think we are in the position to do that as well. What's going on in the general public then, there is this issue of boycotting Israeli related products, which I think quite a huge part of the public really takes that quite seriously. So some businesses is already experiencing the backlash of this, the impact of this boycott. But then again, to what degree this will have any impact on the conflict itself, that's another question.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal, and today I'm joined by Dr. Shafiah Muhibat, who's an Indonesian scholar and political analyst. Dr. Muhibat currently serves as the Deputy Executive Director for Indonesia's Center for Strategic and International Studies, the CSIS, which is not the same and not connected to the American think tank of the same name. I have been wanting to talk to an Indonesian expert for a while to discuss the geopolitical challenges of her home country and also of Southeast Asia a bit more generally. So thank you, Dr. Muhibat, for coming online today.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, Shafiah, we had some exchanges before this, and one of the big things to come up in next month is actually the Indonesian general election, in which you're going to elect a new president and also a new parliament, right? Everything's going to be renewed. So if you could explain a little bit about what Indonesia's main foreign policy concerns have been over the past couple of years, and what you're foreseeing for the future. Do you think this will be the same? Will Indonesia's approach still be the same after the elections, especially since you've been under the same president now for 2 consecutive terms, right, for the last 8 years, Mr. Widodo? Do you foresee big changes in Indonesia's foreign policy or not?
Sure, fantastic question. I think for Indonesia, our main concern is always Southeast Asia. So whatever security challenges faces Southeast Asia, that would be Indonesia's biggest concern as well. And now I think there are several issues, several hotspots for conflict, I think, in our direct neighborhood. But I think all of those can be related to great power competition. So geopolitical rivalry, US-China relations. I think that is one factor that greatly influenced all of the other issues going on in Southeast Asia and also the greater Indo-Pacific, I think. And I think for Indonesia, the main concern is not really the US-China competition per se, but number one, it's how the competition impacts Southeast Asia, because whether we like it or not, this is the backyard for the competition. Everything that goes on between US and China, that will greatly impact Southeast Asia. Number two, the great concern is that because Indonesia itself and also Southeast Asian countries as a whole are still pretty much, maybe I could use the word clueless, or we basically have no idea how to deal or what sort of policies, what sort of strategies we should have in order to prevent any negative impacts from this geopolitical rivalry. So those are, I think, the 2 main issues that present the greatest challenge, not only for Indonesia, but I think also for Southeast Asia as a whole.
So how do you think, or how did the current administration deal with this challenge? Because it got worse and worse, right? This rivalry between the US and China, and also China's claims in the South and East China Seas, right, which are not directly impacting Indonesia. There's no overlapping claims with Indonesia, but Indonesia has very, very close ties with Malaysia and Vietnam and the Philippines, of course. And of course, the ASEAN Secretariat is in Jakarta, right? You must be very much impacted by what's happening. And then the issue of the next administration. Are you in any kind kind of like worried that something big is going to change at home or not?
Okay, I think for Indonesia, foreign policy, the basis of our foreign policy hardly changes, if you understand what I'm saying. I mean, we always say, the doctrine is independent and active, not siding with any blocs. And of course, this was created back in the 1940s, where it was very heavily, World War II and then Cold War. Always this position that Indonesia will never side with any blocs, will engage with all countries equally. And I think that's something that is still maintained until now. So for the longest time, Indonesia has been trying to maintain good relations with both the US and with China. Although, of course, throughout different sectors, you would find different types of relations, but in all of these cases, Indonesia will never be that country which will say we're siding with one side. So maintaining independence in our foreign policy, and then being active in terms of pursuing our interests, and I think that's still the main issue. So that's the basis. Well, of course, you would see then throughout different administration, you would find different characteristics or different priorities, but the basis will remain the same. So for President Widodo, I mean, he's been quite active in terms of building infrastructure. And of course, when you talk about building infrastructure, then China is the one offering the biggest investment in not only Indonesia, but I think, in other parts of the world as well. So that's why, for the longest time, I think throughout his 10-year presidency, he's often being accused of being closer to China than to the US. I really cannot agree with that, because I do think that Indonesia still seeks to maintain this relations and pursuing relations with both the US and China. And I think Indonesia is one of those countries who seeks to sort of like maintain like a dual track when we deal with China. So there's one track when we have this close economic cooperation, and on the other hand, there's this track where we maintain our political security cooperation. And what we do is that, and I don't think this is exclusive to Indonesia, I think a lot of countries are having this strategy as well. Whatever goes on in one track, we seek for it not to influence the other track. So for example, whatever goes on in the North Natuna Sea, whatever clashes or incidents we would have with China in the North Natuna Sea, so far, I mean, if you look at at least the past 5 years or 10 years, it has not really influenced our close economic cooperation. So maybe some other countries do not have this luxury, but I think this is for Indonesia at least, and I think a number of other countries as well. This is a strategy that we seek to follow. But there is a caveat here, I think, and this is something that we need to really concentrate upon. This strategy works now, but I don't see a guarantee that it will continue to work in the future, given the changes that China is going through, looking at how China in some issues are becoming more assertive. So we might have to face a time when this strategy no longer works. There might be a time in the future where, whatever happens in the North Natuna Sea will eventually impact our economic relations with China. It's not the case yet, but I think Indonesia needs to be prepared with that. And I think that's something that's still lacking in the thinking of the Indonesian government at the moment.
Yeah, and the United States too often tries to conflate economic issues with security issues, right? The fact that countries have close economic cooperation is something that the United States often phrases in terms of security threats, and then tries to tell countries you cannot buy Huawei products because that's a national security threat and stuff like that. Does Indonesia feel this pressure as well coming from the US, or are you left alone more or less?
We definitely do feel the pressure. We do feel the pressure, and I think that's also one of the challenges that we face that's related to the competition, right? The fact that we are being, not only Indonesia, but I think Southeast Asia as a whole, we are being pushed basically to pick a side, and that's something that Indonesia always tries to avoid. And if you look at Southeast Asia as a whole, 11 countries. You would see countries with very, varying degrees of relations with either the US and China. There are some countries who are, closely linked to China, mentioning maybe Cambodia or Laos. There are countries that are closely linked to the US. Philippines is one country, and there are countries like Indonesia who, who seeks to basically, maintain good relations with both of them. So you see these vast differences, but I think both China and the US are trying to change this. Basically, it's their interest that countries really pick a side in this competition, and it's something that is really putting pressure in each and every country in Southeast Asia, but I think also put pressure in the unity of ASEAN or of Southeast Asia as a whole.
Which one worries you more, China or the US?
Oh, wow. Okay, answering that, neither. What we are, like I mentioned in the very beginning, what we are concerned about is the competition. And even that, not only the competition itself, but the negative implication of that competition to our region. So it's not about the US or China, but it's what they do to each other, which negatively impacts the region.
Yeah, this Neutrality Studies channel here, and what I'm also looking at is exactly this problem of countries that get caught in the middle, and then how they try to somehow chart an independent course, and usually they're being accused of being too close to the other one by each one of them. Have you been, over the last years, like let's say the last 10 years, have you felt that this increases actively, like from both sides, or no? Or has it always been like that?
You mean the pressures?
Yeah, the pressure.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's something that is felt. You mentioned, there's different sanctions coming in from one side to the other. And then this, establishments of these various unilateral frameworks, Quad, AUKUS, and so on. And China, for quite some time, then was very aggressive with its BRI projects as well. Of course, these are all pressures. And what's worrying is that countries in Southeast Asia, and I'm pretty sure in other parts of the world as well, we are in the midst of this competition, but we are made as spectators, basically. There's hardly anything that we can do to influence the course of this competition, but we are bearing the negative impacts of it.
Are you worried, or are you experiencing any kind of foreign influence that goes beyond just putting in foreign policy pressure on you? Like, you're going to have elections. Like, are you worried about Chinese influences or US influences on your domestic politics, or is that one fine?
I wouldn't say fine, but I'm not worried about it either. And I think this relates to what I said earlier about Indonesia having certain, well, quote unquote, luxury of, us being a country like Indonesia, as opposed to other countries. I'm not going to name one, but countries that are less stable, less developed, probably, and more, a lot more dependence on either US or China. Those countries might not have the luxury to actually, avoid this sort of influence. But I think for Indonesia, we are a lot more able to resist this risks. And specifically for the election, yes, there are concerns, but it's not something on the top the priority when it comes to the election itself, because there are other problems as well, mostly domestic.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge challenge. You've got 17,000 islands, and organizing all of that. And you're the largest ASEAN country, right? In terms of size, 270 million people.
Yes, more or less that
More or less.
number. Yeah.
What is the biggest security concern? Is it your sea lanes of communication? Is it the, like, security wise, what's at the heart of what Indonesia wants to achieve in order to have stability?
Oh, wow. That kind of question, you ask different people, you would get different answers. You ask the Navy, of course, they're concerned about the sea lanes. You ask the diplomats, they would give you a different answer. But I think, all in all, Indonesia is lacking a lot in terms of our security. We don't really have a clear-cut, good strategy in terms of, defense and security. And I think that translates to a lot of challenges in different sectors. So naming one or two would be really unfair to the number of different issues that need taken care of. But you're absolutely right. I mean, some of the issues that you mentioned, those are great concerns, but those are not the only ones.
Yeah. Okay. So as always, security is a multi problem on
Sure,
several fronts.
sure.
Are you do you think that the collaboration inside ASEAN, because ASEAN is a very interesting grouping, right? Quite loose in a sense. On the other hand, it has been producing a lot of initiatives over the last 50, 60 years. Do you think this will increase, like ASEAN cooperation? Do you think more ASEAN countries will flock closer together now that the pressure from China and the United States is increasing?
You know what's interesting about ASEAN, it's the the quality of the work and function of ASEAN has been quite dependent on what kind of challenges are present. So if you say, you read a lot of literatures and which would portray all of the success stories of ASEAN throughout the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. Absolutely, those were success stories, and ASEAN was capable and very much relevant in responding to the ongoing challenges back then. But then the challenges now is of course different back, compared to the 1980s and 1990s. And looking at these current challenges, ASEAN is apparently not well equipped to still be relevant in a way. So, for example, the easiest way of looking at it is that ASEAN for the longest time has been successful in terms of managing intra-ASEAN disputes, right? And then trying to establish this regional integration process. And those are the things that we have been successful in. But we have never had the precedence of actually dealing with an issue that comes from a major power outside of the region. So, for example, China. So, and that's when I think ASEAN is falling short, and we still do not have the right tools, the right mechanism in handling or whatever issues we might have with China, and also in this great power competition as a whole.
Okay, and maybe let's talk now a little bit also about the conflicts that are currently going on. I mean, Indonesia being in this very geostrategically difficult place, but far away from the current conflicts, especially the one in Ukraine, and then the other one, this genocide that's going on in Palestine against the Palestinians. So, how have you and how has the Indonesian public perceived these two conflicts? Maybe first the Ukrainian one, and then the current one in Gaza.
Okay, of course, then the two conflicts would be viewed quite differently in Indonesia. The Ukraine one, I mean, Indonesia basically, we acknowledge the significant impact it has on the global political, economic landscape, and I think this includes our region as well. But it's still, to a large degree seen as something distant. So, we sitting in Southeast Asia, of course, our main concern would be related, like as I said, to the major power rivalry, to China. And the issues, yes, we acknowledge what happens in Ukraine has significant impact, but it doesn't replace, the existing problems that Indonesia already has in the region. I'm not sure if that makes sense at all, but it still seems as something very different. Very distant, and doesn't replace our imminent problem and challenges in the region. So I guess in a way that's the overall sentiment we have. So our main concern when it comes to Ukraine is, what are the impacts it has directly on Indonesia and on Southeast Asia. And I think at the beginning, if you see, President Widodo's visit to both Kiev and to Moscow back in 2022, yes, it's seen as some sort of like a peace,
Initiative.
with peaceful, initiative. But I think, on the back of the mind, it's seen as, at the time we were president of the G20, he was trying to ensure success to the G20 summit. There were concerns about food prices and energy prices, and I think that's, so not really the war itself or the war per se, but more on the, what sort of impacts, negative impact it would have on our country or our region. And I think it remains that way, as for now. So not only Indonesia, but I think most Southeast Asian governments regard the war in Ukraine as distant crisis, which means that, there is very little incentive to take a clear stand. So if you follow, this matter, ASEAN has been, well, relatively cautious in its response to the war itself. You can see, ASEAN countries avoid taking sides in this matter, and there is clear divisions in the region's relations with Russia. Yes, the ASEAN foreign ministers did have a statement released. I think it was in February 2022, so maybe a couple of weeks after the start of the war. But the statement, expressed deep concern over the situation, called on maximum restraint and so on. So, but it's very diplomatic, very normative, but not a word that would say that we are taking a clear stand on the war. So I guess until now, I don't think it has changed, which still reflects how we view the war itself as a distant crisis.
Why do you think it is that while ASEAN countries, Indonesia included, have taken a more nuanced stance, that Australia and New Zealand are so firmly embedded in, like, this what I and a lot of others just call the collective West? Is race still a factor in international politics? Because, like, it makes total sense that from Indonesia's perspective, Europe is very far away, and that therefore you kind of try not to be sucked into either side of the conflict. But Australia and New Zealand take a completely different approach. Japan too, not as strongly as Australia, but as well. So why is that in your view?
I might not be able to give you a clear-cut answer on this. Those studying policy making in Australia, New Zealand, and Japan might be more knowledgeable about this. But I do think that, the degree of, or the differences in terms of relations with Russia and how we view the connection with Russia plays quite a significant role in deciding this. And, for countries like Indonesia, and I think a lot of other countries as well, when there are decision making on issues like this, it's always, what impact or what consequence will it have on us? And I do think that, for countries like Australia, like New Zealand, they're very much concerned about international law and the uphold of certain principles. So the war itself is seen as a direct threat to them as well, because they uphold all of these principles. It doesn't mean that countries like Indonesia do not uphold these principles, but there are certain ways that you try to uphold it. So I think some people discussed this earlier. For countries like Indonesia, not saying that we put sanction this or sanction that doesn't mean that we agree to the war. Not agreeing to the war and being opposed to the invasion itself doesn't have to translate directly in certain policies, which involves hard decision like sanctions. And there's a limitations of what certain countries can do. And I think this is what Indonesia is trying to acknowledge, that for us, making this statement through ASEAN, Jokowi making this visit, that is also for us already a stance of how we view the war in Ukraine. And I do believe that, countries' policies should not be uniform.
Oh, I completely agree with you,
Mm,
you know, and my big criticism toward the collective West is always that they
mm,
uphold international law when it is convenient to do so, and then
mm.
they undermine it or outright break it when that one is convenient, while
Sure.
they always tell other countries how to run their shows, right? And in Indonesia's focus on domestic predicaments and interests, to me, makes complete sense. What doesn't make
Mm.
sense is when countries put that overboard and
Sure.
adhere to some very abstract principles that they then break in other situations. But do you think that this whole perception that the West is kind of a law-abiding and so on, you know, entity, do you think Gaza changes that? Because what's currently happening is absolutely insane, and I belong to the people who
Mm.
do call this a genocide. And the ICJ just gave out a ruling like last Friday that even as a court of international law, they are afraid that genocide might be occurring. Um,
Mm.
Indonesia being a majority Muslim country, the largest Muslim democracy in the world, like how does Gaza factor in public perception?
Okay. Uh, so, so Palestine issue is one of the okay. Let's put it this way: a foreign policy issue is not really the main subject in Indonesia's general public, if you understand what I say. So people are, we're facing election, and foreign policy is never an issue where you decide your vote for. You know what I mean? So people, are concerned about welfare, education, poverty, and so on. But foreign policy is still something that doesn't really interest the general public. Palestine is probably an exception because traditionally it's one of the issues that's been with us for the longest time since the early days of our even our existence as a country during the Afro Asian conference in 1955, for example. It was said that one of the homework that's still not done from that conference is the freedom of Palestine. So it's something that's really on the top of the head when people hear about in the news about Gaza and so on. Having said that, the general public also is not generally aware of these latest developments. So they would read news about, Gaza, about Hamas, about the attack and so on. But then, what they understand is that only the traditional understanding that, Palestine is in threat and Palestine should be free and there should be a Palestinian state and so on. So that's what they understand. So if your question is that whether what happens the past few months has had an influence, my brief answer is no, because people will have that traditional way of thinking when they think about Palestine. And what
They
goes on
already
now,
perceived it as bad in the past, and this
yes,
just shows it's bad still.
yes, yes. They wouldn't understand the details. They wouldn't understand about the attack. Not the fact that they don't understand, but they just, it's
It's not
just
on the agenda.
it's new information that really doesn't add new values to the existing issue, right? So the sentiment is like that. So even with the ruling of the ICJ, yes, it matters maybe for the government, for the elites, but for the general public, it doesn't really have that much a change in terms of their perception.
I see, I see. So the feelings boil much hotter in other Muslim countries, I suppose. So Indonesia, in a sense, looks at this still as one of the problems that has been around for a long time.
Yes, so for a lot of the Indonesian public, when something like the past few months is not really a new problem, but it's more as a reminder that we still need to protest for something that has not been achieved. So it just adds more, a reminder that we still have a homework to do.
Uh, I think Indonesia also supported South Africa's
Yes,
case, right?
yes.
Do you know, is the Indonesian government are going to do any kind of follow-ups on this one, or like what are the official approaches of Indonesia toward Gaza?
Well, it's yes, the Indonesian government supports the South African effort. There and that from what understanding is that the foreign ministry has been quite serious about this, and there are a number of steps that the government has taken. So, for example, through the Security Council, through the UN, and this is another channel that they do. I'm not sure what the follow-up would be from the Indonesian point of view with regards to the ICJ, because I think well, I'm not sure to say this a problem, but one factor on this particular issue is that we are not yet party to the Rome Statute.
Yeah, right.
So
The
that's
ICC.
that creates a little bit of complexity regarding to what extent we can actually follow up from the ruling of the ICJ.
But maybe in general, do you think Indonesia is trying to work a lot through the institutions of international law? Because, right now it seems to me that we are seeing international law coming apart in quite many different ways. On the one hand, the politicization of certain courts, like the ICC, that has been very quick in indicting Vladimir Putin and has been absolutely silent on the war in Gaza. On the other hand, we see a lot of breaches of international law. Does this make you overall more do you still have hope that international law can also help Indonesia to navigate the current situations?
Well, to be frank, for a country like Indonesia, there isn't much more alternative, is there?
Yeah, right.
So when going through ICJ, being a non-party to the Rome Statute, that all I think already shows that we are willing to take whatever is on the table that we can still do in terms of at least voicing our concerns about Gaza, and that shows that we really do not have any much more alternative about what we can do. For example, an individual statement from Indonesia, of course, would be even less efficient or relevant in terms of this problem. So so to answer that question, it's not really about how much we believe in international law and so on, but it's just being realistic about what sort of efforts we can actually do. While this issue is, we still have to keep in mind that it's in the heart of a lot of Indonesian public. So the government has to do something about it, but how can they do it? We're presented with so very little alternatives.
Was there ever any concerns or thinking about breaking relations with Israel, or like having sanctions on Israel, even though there's not a lot of export going probably to Israel? But was that ever a topic?
Absolutely, yes. That's a topic. For one, I mean, we don't have diplomatic relations with Israel, so there's nothing to break.
Okay, right.
Second of all, which means that we also don't have, sort of like formal trade relations and so on directly with Israel. We don't have that, so there's nothing to break as well. In terms of sanction, I don't think the government can officially put sanction and everything. I don't think we are in the position to do that as well. What's going on in the general public then, there is this issue of boycotting Israeli related products, which I think quite a huge part of the public really takes that quite seriously. So some businesses is already experiencing the backlash of this, the impact of this boycott. But then again, to what degree this will have any impact on the conflict itself, that's another question.
All right, thank you for that assessment. Maybe a last question about to come back to the first question, like, who do you think will win the elections next month? What's your best guess?
Oh, wow. CSIS, we've been doing quite a lot of surveys, opinion polls on this, and then we're going to do a quick count on the D-Day of the election itself. And you're looking at the result of our survey and looking at the result of surveys of other survey institutions in Indonesia. It's pretty clear that Prabowo has the upper hand. I think I think all of the survey results from various results show that he has now about 40%, even more than 40% of the vote. There are changes in terms of the two other candidates, Ganjar and Anies, would sometimes would have its increase or decrease. But Prabowo has been quite stagnant in the number 40 something, 43, 45, 46. So if you look at from that point of view only, it's pretty clear about that. What people are discussing right now is not really about who will win, but whether there's going to be a second round. Because if one candidate doesn't have 51% plus 20% from at least 20 provinces, then there has to be a second round. So people are discussing that if, and I think it's going to be quite detrimental, whether it's only one round or two rounds, because if Prabowo wins in only one round, he's going to have an ample amount of time to get a solid government running, and he's going to have quite a big power on a lot of policy making across all sectors. But if it's a two rounds, and hopefully it'll be a much more balanced administration, taking into account all the different parties as well. So I don't know, but it seems from this standpoint, two rounds would be somewhat better in terms of having a more balanced government later this year.
All right, so that's something to look out for. Shafiah, thank you very much for taking the time for explaining Indonesia's predicaments at the moment. That was very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you again for having me.